Hi everyone, welcome to my lecture recital. And right now I'm gonna share screen with you so you can see the PowerPoint that on my computer. Okay, here it is. Okay. So my lecture recital topic is an introduction for Chinese art songs from 1920 to 1950. This is a lecture based on my BMA dissertation. It is a survey of selected classical Chinese art songs for solo voice and piano from 1920 to 1950. This work is mainly a repertoire guide for musicians and teachers who need to perform, teach, or research Chinese art songs. It is a study that provides a practical and concise resource for singers who are looking for new songs outside the scope of standard ensemble repertoire. All the entries are listed in a notated listing of the songs. Each entry will include basic information like the name of the composer, the poet, the name of the title in English and in pronunciation of Chinese, and the publisher and the year, the composition year, and the poem style. It depends on a classical Chinese poetry or modern Chinese poetry. Also listing with voice type, if it's a soprano or mezzo-soprano or baritone or tenor, or it fits for all voice types. And also including tessitura and etc. And you can see more information in the next following sample. Here is a sample, and you can see a listing composer here with the name and also in Chinese and the years. And if it's a piano arrangement in a later time, you can also see the arranger's name following by the composer, and also the titles, name in Chinese character, translation in English, and publisher, and also the composition year, poet, poem style. And this is a modern style poetry, and if it's a song based on classical Chinese poetry, it will be also listing here. And this is a beginning level song. And if it's an intermediate or advanced level, you can also see in here. And the voice type, this one is fitting for soprano or mezzo-soprano. And tessitura, duration, and the following I'll be listing voice characteristics and piano accompaniment. You can see in here with more detailed analysis of the characteristics for the music. And you can further see if this will be fitting for the level for your student. And in the comment part, usually you can find the composition background or the information for the composer or poet, or the aesthetic meaning of the song, and maybe some fun stories there too. Next, let's look into the sample of lyric and translations. It's listed in the appendix. And for instance, if you are interested in this one, Xiang Lei, composed by Chen Xiaokong, and you want to further look into the lyric and translations, or you want to use it as a reference when you're practicing, this part will be really helpful. And it listed with Chinese characteristics, Chinese characters, and following by English translations. And this part is the pinyin part. Next one is the sample of composer index. So there's also a composer index listing in the appendix, and it's organized in alphabetic order. Each composer is listed with the name in English and name in Chinese, name in pinyin. And this one is Chen Tianhe. Chen Tianhe. And he had 5 songs that have been selected into the study. So all the song title will be listed here with the reference into Chinese characters and composition year. Okay, so let's say if you are interested into one song and you don't know the composer. So here you can find all the titles and songs that is selected into the study. And it's also there is a title index in the appendix. So in the appendix, you can find all the titles that organized in alphabetical orders. And here's the first one, 安睡吧勇士, and listed with the 2 page numbers. And the first page number is referring to the page of the noted list of the songs that you can find all the basic information for each entry. And then you can see the next page number, it is referring to the translation of the lyrics in English. And that is the page number for that. And for the title in Chinese, and you can see the composition year is accompanied by it. And then if you want pinyin for the title, and it's following by it, and then it's the English translation. So today, I'm going to introduce you to the historical background and the development of Chinese art song from 1920 to 1950. Following of all those topics that we're gonna talk about today, like historical background, first Chinese art song characteristics, and the development following in each period. Chinese art song is a very unique vocal music genre. It was derived from Western music and was deeply rooted in Chinese culture. Before the early 1920s, Chinese voice performance was dominated by Chinese opera, Chinese folk song, and traditional music. So in the beginning of the 20th century, radical changes were happening in the Chinese political and social systems. Chinese art songs emerged as the result of these radical changes. So the radical changes including the end of imperial rule and the establishment of the Republic of China, the influence of democracy from Western society, the new cultural movement, and the emergence of modern Chinese poetry. Now we're going to talk about the fall of Qing dynasty. At the beginning of the 20th century, the imperial rule of the Qing dynasty ended. Chinese feudal society that had lasted for thousands of years ended. It is ended with the fall of Qing dynasty and resulted in drastic political change. Here, if you look at the PowerPoint, you can see this is the first king, and this is the last king of the Qing dynasty. And this is the map of the empire of the Great Qing. If you remember here, this part, if you look at here, when we go on to the next slide, you will know like this part is smaller. This is the symbol of the country. So in 1912, the Republic of China was established, replacing this previous political system. It showed the influence of democracy from the Western society. In order to change the old feudal social system, Chinese scholars and pioneers sought the solutions from Western social systems, science, and culture. they opposed the traditional Chinese social system, and they want to implementing Western ideas of democracy and freedom, and hope to use Western science and education to transform Chinese society. Right here, you can see this is a map of Republic of China. And some parts of China has been divided out because of the war and the falling of the Qing dynasty. And he is a very important leader for Republic of China. His name is Sun Zhongshan, and this is a flag, and those are the monies that they use, just for some fun information. So in 1919, a very important political and social change happened in China. It's called the New Culture Movement. Chinese intellectuals and scholars launched the New Culture Movement, also called the May 4th Movement. It was an ideological and cultural innovation that aimed to solve the social and political crisis in China. They initiated vernacular literature and civilian education at the beginning of the New Culture Movement. Here is two pictures that shows the actual movement that people going on the street and raising their flags and declared and advocate for democracy and independence. Now let's talk about the emergence of modern Chinese poetry. The modern Chinese poetry emerged and was developed as a result of the New Culture Movement. Many Chinese literature scholars began to write new poems under the influence of Western literary style. Modern Chinese poems were written and created in a distinct contrast with classical Chinese poems. Modern Chinese poems were written in vernacular language instead of classical Chinese. They later became an important literary foundation for Chinese art songs. The vernacular language in China became increasingly popular. Because of that, more and more people use the vernacular language to write poetry instead of using classical Chinese. So let's talk about the distinct difference between Chinese vernacular language and classical Chinese. So all classical Chinese poetry exclusively used the classical Chinese. Classical Chinese was mainly used as written language for the nobles and royalty, especially those scholars and literary people. Mostly common people could not understand classical Chinese. So in order to educate and change the life of common people, the New Culture Movement advocated utilizing vernacular language as the written language in literature. The use of this written vernacular language in poetry became a very, very important innovative breakthrough in Chinese literacy history. So I listed an example here. You can see here are two lines from a Ci poem. It's kind of a classical Chinese poem that written by Su Shi, a poem master from Song Dynasty. The poem's name is 水调歌头明月几时有. That is meant the prelude of the water tune. How long until the full moon appears? So you can see in the first line and second line for the classical Chinese, each line only has 5 characters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So The line under it that has very, very long and has many characters in it are vernacular Chinese. And the line under it are English translation. So let's see this one. In classical Chinese, that is read as 起舞弄清影. 起舞弄清影. Very short, concise, and if you translate it into vernacular language in Chinese, it would mean 我起身跳起翩翩的舞蹈，看着月下我的身影也在摆弄着舞姿。Which means I rise and dance with my shadow, and my shadow is dancing with me under the moon. Wow, 5-character Chinese in classical Chinese can be translated into a almost two full sentence in vernacular Chinese. It is a big difference and contrast. And let's see next one. 何似在人间. When translated into vernacular Chinese, it means 我认为回到天宫怎么比得上在人间的生活. It means in English, I would not want to go heaven. The life in the human world is much better. So from observation, you can see the classical Chinese is much more concise. Only 2 words here, 起舞can mean a full line. 我起身跳起翩翩的舞蹈. I rise and dance with my shadow. It's a very distinct contrast, and it shows like a classical Chinese has very concise meaning and it's not very easy to understand. So if I am a common person from modern Chinese society or even from Qing dynasty, if I have never been able to be trained in classical Chinese, I would not be able to understand or appreciate any words written right here. But I would definitely be able to understand the vernacular Chinese. If somebody read it to me, or if I can read this, I will be able to understand. So that's probably why the new culture movement were advocating the vernacular language as written language in Chinese literature. It's largely related with civil education and the transformation of the life of common people. The use of this written vernacular language in poetry is very important for them to make the first step where common people can easily appreciate the poems and literature. And it would further help improve and the rise of civilian culture. So with all those influences in the historical background, at the beginning of the 20th century, Chinese musicians also traveled abroad to study Western music system in US and Europe. They went to all kinds of music institutes, like for instance, Zhao Yuanren went to Yale, and Huang Zi also went there. And in the later time, also Tan Xiaolin, he went to Oberlin and Yale also. So after they learn and study the Western music system, they brought their music back to China, and they creatively combined the composition technique of Western music with Chinese literary and ethnic music styles. So the Chinese art song as a new genre was born in this fusion of innovation. Now let's look at the first Chinese art song. The first Chinese art song is composed by Qingzhu. Here is a picture of Qingzhu. And the name is 大江东去. That is the pinyin, 大江东去. It means the river flowing to the east. It was composed by Qingzhu in 1920. When he composed the song, he was still studying at Berlin University in 1920 in German. So Qingzhu chose the classical poem that composed by master poet Su Shi from the Song Dynasty. The poem described the magnificent scenery on the river and crafted the memory of the heroes of Three Kingdom period, especially Zhou Yu. And he was a very famous general and a very successful, influential figure in politics. And when he remembered all of this, and he feels a regret feeling that he was not being able to achieving his political dream. So that's the basic meaning of the poem. And now let's listening a clip of the song. We're just gonna listen part of the song. If you're interested, you can click the link and listen more later. I'm gonna share another screen with you. Here, I'm gonna start this recording. It's sung by Shen Yang, a baritone, a Chinese baritone, and the piano playing by Yang Liqing. 三国周郎论是风雨尽头卷起千堆雪，卷起千堆雪。 Okay, I'm gonna stop right here, since we have we have the link there, and you can listen more if you like the song. And now I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. I'm gonna continue. Okay, this is a very beautiful song, and now you have listened a little bit of Chinese art song, and what characteristics of Chinese art song does Chinese art song have? First, it is derived from Western art songs. That is makes Chinese art songs different from other types of songs like folk song and qu-yi, also called ballad singing in China. And it inherited essential characteristics from Western art songs, especially German Lied in the 19th century. Here I listed the three primary characteristics of Chinese art songs. First, Chinese composers established a high standard for selecting poems for their music. So some are poems directly chosen from famous and renowned poets. The music composition was primarily meant to express poetic temperament and literary aesthetics, like the one that you just hear was chosen from a poet master from Song Dynasty. His name is Su Shi. And secondly, the theme of art songs included self-expression, freedom, individual feeling, humanity, and real-life situation. And third, the accompaniment was no longer a supplement to the voice, but an integral part of the music. Also, as example, when you hear 大象东去, there is a very long interlude and showing and expressing the piano figure as a very important part of the music. And like say the function including like setting the atmosphere, expressing the theme, and uniting all sections of the song. So in another aspect, Chinese art song also deeply rooted in Chinese ethnic music. Those are also very important characteristics of Chinese art song. Now, Zhao Yuanzhen was the first person who established the ethnic development of a Chinese art song. Because he was a linguistic expert who had studied many ethnic dialects and conversations from all over China. He also collected and wrote them down into collections. Those were collected into books. So when he composing, he used slides and ornaments and even tones of children singing to mimic the accents of the different regions. He called it adding Chinese flavor to the music. For example, the song Tingyu means listening to the rain. It was composed in 1928. This song imitated people's chanting tone of classical Chinese poems in the city of Changzhou. Changzhou is a southern city where people's dialect had developed over 3,000 years of history. Now I'm going to show you a short video clip of Changzhou dialect that read by Zhao Yuanzhen. And he was reading some shi poetry from Tang Dynasty. Now I'm gonna share. Now I'm gonna share the video part with you. Okay. Yes. Oh. There we go. 谁高中帅帅跟谁，举白小人谁跟谁，真正来出的生意，领导上发龙比谁。Very interesting. If there's no captions, I would not be able to understand him when he's speaking those dialects. They are very distinct difference between south and north, like dialects. So when I see the captions, that is the only way that I can understand him. And the tones and the choosing the words and makes big differences. And after hearing this, you can listen to Tingyu now, and you can find like it is very similar tones that with this speaking tone. this is a very gentle and beautiful song. And if you have time, you can go back to the link and comparing the speaking tone by Zhao Yanren and also this one that's sung by Shen Yang for their similarity of the tones. And you can find out like this song was written by consideration of imitating people's chanting tone and speaking tone. Okay, let's move on back to the PowerPoint. And besides that, many Chinese art song composers use the modern Chinese poetry as lyrics. Zhao Yanren's 叫我如何不想他 and also Xiao Youmei's 问 and are very good examples for those kind of those types of Chinese art songs. Starting in the 1940s, more composers start to focus on Chinese folk songs and folk songs. Some composers like Ding Shande and Wang Luobin, they collected and arranged numerous folk songs into Chinese art songs. We're going to talk more about them when we are moving to 1940s. Now let's talk about early Chinese art songs, the Chinese art songs in the 1920s. I listed 3 pioneer composers for this period of art songs. They are Xiao Youmei, Qing Zhu, and Zhao Yanren. So Xiao Youmei is, and their pictures are listed under the names. Qing Zhu, we already mentioned him in the clips of the first Chinese art song, 大江东去. Qing Zhu's real name was Liao Shangguo. He used the pseudonym because he had actively participated in organizations that protested the government. He had to escape after the failure of the protesting. He needed a pseudonym to cover up his identity. He published many articles on music theory, and he was also the editor of major music magazines. Xiao Youmei published his first songbook, 金乐曲集, means Music Today First Collection, in 1922. It included numerous classical art songs like 问, Question, 1922, and 南非之谚语, The Tale of the Geese Flying South, in 1923. It's worth mentioning here, in 1927, he helped establish the institution, National Conservatory of Music in Shanghai. It is China's first professional institution of musical higher education. The most influential composer among them was Zhao Yanren. He was the first person who established the ethnic development of Chinese art songs. He composed more than 100 songs in his lifetime. His first songbook, 新诗歌集, New Songs Collection, was published in 1928. We're going to talk more about him later. So when we are moving to 1930s for Chinese art songs, we're going to talk about 2 types of Chinese art songs. And we're also going to talk about the emergence of patriotic art songs. So we said there are 2 types of Chinese art songs. The first one is art songs based on classical Chinese poetry. And the second one is art songs based on modern Chinese poetry. So let's talk about classical Chinese poetry. When it had a long history dating back to Zhou dynasty. So the first poetry book, Shi Jing, was written back then. The development of classical Chinese poetry was continued into Qing dynasty, spanning about 2,000 years. Because those poems developed over such a long period of time, various poems with different styles and patterns emerged. It was a challenging task to compose songs based on classical Chinese poetry because it required the composer to have a substantial knowledge of classical Chinese literature. Here I listed some typical style of the classical Chinese poetry. It has 楚辞, hanfu, shi, and ci. Here I listed two important composers and a very influential composer for art songs based on classical Chinese poetry. The first one is Huang Zi. He used many classical style poems from different periods. Here I list some examples, and the first one is Nan Xiangzi. It means Song of the Southern Country. It was based on a Zi poem written by the poet Jin Qiji from the Song dynasty. And Huang Fei Hua, flowers are not flowers, is a Shi poem by Bai Juyi from Tang dynasty. So Song dynasty and Tang dynasty has emerged different type of classical Chinese poetry. And you can see Shi poetry is another type of classical Chinese poetry. It is in contrastive form with Zi poetry. And Qing Zhu, as we mentioned before, he is the first composer who introduced Chinese classical poetry into this genre. And for his song Dajiang Dongqu, he set the poem Reflection on Ancient Red Cliff to the tune of Nian Nu Jiao. This is a Ci poem by Su Shi from Song dynasty. Ci and Shi has contrasted the patterns and forms, and they emerged in different times. So art songs based on modern Chinese poetry. Unlike classical Chinese poetry, art songs based on modern Chinese poetry use the vernacular language. As a result, it was easier for the common people to understand and appreciate. The primary purpose of the songs was not to express the aesthetic of the poem, like in the classical Chinese poetry art song, but rather to express the common individual's personal feeling and realities. Typically, a single song can present a wider range of emotions, like sadness, anger, depression, and in contrast with joyful. Some composers utilize recitative-like compositions borrowed from Western opera in order to reflect speaking tones and changing emotions. A very important representative composer for art songs based on modern Chinese poetry is He Lüding. His song Jialing Jiang Shang, it means on the Jialing River, is a very good example for using recitative-like melody to narrate people's story from the wall. And this storytelling method made expression very realistic and easy to understand for the audience. Now I'm going to show you a short clip of the video. I'm going to share the screen for the video part again. and it's also sung by Shen Yang. And the piano player, the accompaniment is Zhang Liang. Okay, and also here in the PowerPoint, it has the link of the YouTube video, and if you like the song, you can hear more later. Okay, let's continue. And another important composer is Zhao Yuanren that we mentioned before. A good example will be his Tingyu. He wrote the melody with consideration of speech pattern and rhythm, and he's a very influential figure for that. So other important composers, if you like, you can also look into them and go see in the listing in my study. And there's Huang Zi, Liu Xuan, Nie Er, Chen Tianhe, and Jiang Dingxian. They also composed many art songs that were based on modern Chinese poetry. Now let's talk about patriotic art songs. In 1931, Japan invaded the northeast region of China and causing the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was part of World War II. Many intellectuals started the anti-Japanese movement in China. Patriotic songs became a very important part of this movement. The lyrics of patriotic art songs were very expressive, easy to understand for the audience, and usually related to the war. Some of the lyrics described the people's desperation, and some expressed their hope for victory and called people to fight. And here we're going to talk about two important representative composers. One is Nie Er, is the picture on the left, and one is Xian Xinghai. Nie Er composed the China's national anthem, 义勇军进行曲, in 1935. It means March of the Volunteer. The anthem was a typical patriotic song that was utilized to call people to fight for the country and fight for freedom. He also wrote many songs that depicted the suffering of Chinese people endured during the war. For instance, Mei Niang Qu, Song of Mei Niang, was a good example of this type of song. The song described a woman named Mei Niang's despair when she learned that her lover was injured and lost his memory during the war and could not recognize her anymore. So Xian Xinghai is another important composer for patriotic art songs. He wrote his best-known patriotic piece, Yellow River Cantata, in 1938. It described the stories of ordinary people during the war. It was a large-scale vocal work that consists of solo, duet, chorus, and monologue speaking. 3 solo songs from the Yellow River Cantata are Huanghe, Song, Ode to Yellow River, Huangshui Yao, Ballad of Yellow River, and Huanghe Yuan, the Yellow River Resentment, became classic in the classic Chinese art song repertoire. Now we're going to introduce Chinese art songs in the 1940s. So in 1940s, composer gave more attention to folk songs and considered them a new source for the development of ethnic style of Chinese art songs. Some composers collected folk songs from different regions of China into songbooks and arranged them into art song styles. Ding Shande is an important composer for collecting folk songs into art songs. His song 槐花几时开 When Will Sephora Bloom was an important art song that he arranged from a folk song from Sichuan province in China. So this is a picture of Ding Shande. 槐花几时开 was originally a mountain song that's sung during special events in Sichuan countryside. The arrangement gave piano a very important role as demonstrated in a long prelude and its conversation with the voice counterpart. Tingting Chang is a very popular song in China, and it appears in many Chinese recitals and celebrations and galas. And it was arranged by Tingting Chang, and it was based on a Sichuan folk song called Liu Liu Tun. I will sing a very little here for that. 跑马溜溜的山上，一朵溜溜的云哟，潺潺滴滴的山上，一朵溜溜的云哟。Something like that. So there is a lot of word of liu liu appears in the end of the phrase. That's why it's called Liu Liu Tun. And it's a love song. So next one, we're going to introduce Wang Luobin. And he was a famous ethnic composer in China. He collected and arranged more than 1,000 folk songs in his lifetime. One of his early works is 在那遥远的地方, at that distant place. It described a love story that happened in Kazakh area of China. It was a lyrical and expressive song. So use of modern Western composition techniques in 1940s was another important part and development for Chinese art songs. So starting in the 1940s, some composers boldly introduced the modern Western composition techniques into Chinese art songs. There are two important composers we need to mention here. The first one is Pan Xiaolin. Sorry, that was his computer. That was his picture. And this one is Luo Zhongrong, and we're going to talk about him too. So the first one, Pan Xiaolin, as early as 1940s, he composed the 正气歌, means positive song, in 1947. He used his teacher Paul Smith's music system and set the classical style poem written by famous poet Wen Tianxiang in Song Dynasty. It's a song that basically he was meant to use for pedagogical needs. He was a teacher when he came back from US study back to China, and he was wanting to show his students that they can use Paul Smith's method in combination with Chinese music and Chinese words. It was a very innovative technology that he used in composition back then. And Luo Zhongrong, he used the 12-tone technique in his art song 涉江采芙蓉. Even though this work was composed in 1980s, I still think it is worth mentioning here because 涉江采芙蓉 was a poem in 乐府 style. It is a very ancient poetry that composed for singing in Han Dynasty that was thousands of years ago. And the composer Luo Zhongrong combined 12 tone with Chinese pentatonic scale together with this thousands of years of poetry, making a very creative work. I'm going to show you a very short clip of the song, that song by Gong Lin. Okay, we're gonna stop here just for a short listening. And if you're interested, you can go back to the link and listen more. And I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. So, changing the share screen. It takes a little time. Okay, I think we came back. Let's see. Yes. Yay, welcome back. So yeah, those are very beautiful and creative songs. And now we've done talking about 1940s, and we're going to talk a little bit about Chinese art songs after 1950. After 1950, the ethnic style of Chinese music matured greatly. A new generation of musicians magnified the influence of Chinese art songs with the establishment of formal music academies and the advances of music performances. Chinese art songs were increasingly accepted and appreciated by more audiences. And finally, I want to say, it is my hope that this study will help more teachers and musicians gain easier access to Chinese art song repertoire. Let's enjoy the song and sing. Thank you very much. Bye.